So this is our first of the snippets for this week, and remember what we did in class on Monday. A lot of discussion about FDR and the divisions within the Supreme Court during the 1930s, primarily over economic issues, court packing, and the effects of that. But there are, I think, two, and of course, in our presentations, looking at Korematsu and the education cases. But there are two other themes that I think are worth dealing with. One relates to the Constitution of National Security. The other relates to Constitution, what we would call culture wars. And so that's what the snippets for this week we're going to look at. So we're going to go back in time a little bit. Here's the map of the 1916 presidential election, a map that we could not imagine in today's environment. The red states are carried by the Republican, Charles Evans Hughes. The blue states are carried by the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. You'll see that Wilson wins relatively narrowly. It's a very, very close race in the popular vote. Slightly larger tally. Move the screen out here in the Electoral College, but very, very competitive. And Wilson wins in part by running as this anti-war candidate. And if you look closely here, you'll see he carries North Dakota and Nebraska, 13 electoral votes collectively, very Republican states in competitive races. These are states that just, very, very rarely go Democratic. And those 13 electoral votes combined are decisive in the election. If you gave those to Hughes, Hughes would have had 267. Wilson would have had 264, and Hughes would have been elected. And in those states, Wilson gets the endorsement of liberal, really far left. This is the time where these were all Republican states, and there was a very left-wing Republicanism. Republican senators from North Dakota, this guy Astley Grana, and this guy George Norris. Norris, very famous progressive era senator. And so Wilson is running not just as the candidate of the Democrats, but also of these sort of left-wing Republicans who are anti-war. Gets reelected and then turns around and betrays them, brings the country into World War I. This is a painting of Wilson giving the war declaration. And World War I is not World War II. In World War II, there's overwhelming support for the war effort after Pearl Harbor. In World War I, there was significant domestic opposition. There were no public opinion polls, but in parts of the country, probably a majority of Americans opposed entry into the war. 50 representatives, 6 senators vote against the war. Wilson is conscious of the fact that he doesn't have this strong public support. So he pushes through Congress several pieces of legislation, among the most infamous, the Espionage Act of 1917. Key provision for us, the 3 that I have in the bolded area here, making it unlawful for any person in time of war to publish any information the president, in his judgment, declared to be of such character that it is or might be useful to the enemy. Very broad and very significant limitation on speech. And then Wilson follows that up, and Congress passes the Sedition Act of 1918, which makes it a crime to willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States or the Constitution of the United States or the military or naval forces of the United States. So if you criticize the war effort, you can be held in violation of the Sedition Act. These are breathtaking restrictions on speech that Wilson pushes through on grounds that they are promoting the greater good. It's a reminder of how progressivism has some pretty dark sides as well as more reform-minded approaches. So these laws get tested, and the most famous test comes in a case of this man, Charles Schenck, who was a socialist in New York City. He passes out a pamphlet, which you see over here on the right side of the screen, Assert Your Rights. He hands this out to men who are waiting in the selective service line to be drafted, and he's basically saying you have rights against forced conscription, you should use them. This is, by any conceivable stretch of the imagination, protected speech. Schenck is a socialist. He takes this Marxist view to war. He says that World War I is the war of the capitalist classes, and that's the root of his opposition. He is arrested for this pamphleting. He is convicted for violating the Espionage Act, and the case works its way to the Supreme Court in this very famous decision called Schenck versus the United States, written by Justice Holmes, a progressive, so not an ultra-conservative, saying that there are restrictions on free speech that are acceptable. Everyone would say Justice Holmes concedes that falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic is not protected speech. And that's the kind of speech, the court says, that creates a clear and present danger. This is it's a pretty broad test. And the Supreme Court has subsequently, really moved away from this kind of jurisprudence in the First Amendment. But it's a reminder of how restrictive the court could be on some civil liberties issues during the teens and 20s because of national security concerns. And this sort of helps us understand where the court went in Korematsu. And there are big names who are threatened by the Espionage Act. On the left here, this is the cartoon of Robert La Follette, the famous progressive governor and senator, an opponent of World War I. La Follette had gone to Minneapolis, Minnesota, had delivered a speech justifying his vote against World War I, but saying that he hoped that now that the U.S. was in, that the U.S. would win. His speech was initially misreported by the media as saying that he wanted Germany to win. And as a result, there was a nearly 2-year Senate investigation about whether he should be expelled for these remarks. He fares better than Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate presidential candidate from 1912, who gives an anti-war speech based on Socialist Party Marxist principles in Cincinnati, Ohio, is tried, convicted under the Espionage Act, and is sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Wilson refuses to pardon him, and he won't be pardoned until Warren Harding in 1921. So this wave of hostility to civil liberties on grounds of national security culminates in the activities of Wilson's cabinet officials. This man here is the Postmaster General, Postmaster General Burleson, a former Texas congressman, who uses the powers from the Espionage and Sedition Act to block not just anti-war magazines from the mails, but sort of liberal critics of Wilson, and this was a death knell for magazines. So, in the pre-internet era, magazines rely on subscriptions. A critical element of subscription is that they're able to get this thing called second-class postage, which is a reduced postage rate on grounds that they mail out regularly every week or every 2 weeks or every month, whatever the subscription pattern of the magazine is. But a magazine loses this reduced postage rate if it does not deliver an issue on the subscription pattern. So any magazine that was pulled just once from the mails by Postmaster Burleson would also have this financial penalty of losing its reduced subscription rate, and that in turn could threaten the health of the magazine. Burleson was a civil libertarian compared to Wilson's last Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was convinced that there is, in the aftermath of World War I, a communist conspiracy against the United States, and does these raids, so-called Palmer raids, on May Day of 1919, where he's going to expose this Bolshevik plot to overthrow the United States. It turns out there's nothing at all. So one of the major themes of progressive era constitutionalism, it's these constitutional amendments that we looked at in the snippets last time, but it's also this beginning of a pattern with which we become familiar again in World War II, we become familiar again during Vietnam, during the War on Terror after 9/11, of using national security concerns to restrict fundamental civil liberties protections. So that's our first group of snippets for this week.